Celtic Cross. And this is the grave of Hiram Kennedy Douglas, who was an Episcopal priest. And he is in that Kennedy Douglas Art Center family. And it's interesting to note that he found this cross, one similar in England, and he commissioned it to be done. It's 14 feet tall and weighs over 3 tons. So, but he was the closest thing we had to royalty in Florence. He was the 25th cousin to Queen Elizabeth, and was at her coronation. Now, you know, she is now I think the reigning monarch of England, is she not? And surpassed Queen Victoria. And he was related to 16 royal families of Europe. So, quite an interesting man. The family donates the homes that we call the Kennedy Douglas Art Center, and then the fountain in the park is dedicated to one of the Kennedy Douglas family members who died as a young man. So that the park and the homes, the 2 houses, are all part of a complex given through that family. Now, what I've stopped and begin here with is that we talked in class about how many people in the South were Celtic background. And so the Celts were people of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the reason you divide Ireland and Northern Ireland is because the English attempted to calm down the Catholic Irish by bringing in Scots Presbyterians into Northern Ireland. Well, the whole purpose of that was to counter their influence, but it caused a bloodbath for over 200 years between the Irish Catholics and the Scots Presbyterians. Thus bloody Northern Ireland, Belfast, etc., etc. And there's some graves here. So it's interesting that the Presbyterians, these Scots Presbyterians, were mainly from Ulster, and they migrated to America in the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of them went to Ireland because land was available. And we know this, that over 200,000 settled in Ireland, the Scots Presbyterians, between 1608 and 1697. And in the 1630s, they started their migration to America because of the political situation there. So from 1717 to 1770, we know that over 250,000 came to America. So many of us have ancestors in those groups. So there are 2 different Celts. You have the Gaelic Celts. This is Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. Then you have the British Celts, which is the Welsh, the Cornish, and the Bretons. So you have 2 different groups there. But the Celts are the breed we're talking about, this culture. So this is that Celtic cross that you see a lot in southern cemeteries. And if you ever go to Ireland or Scotland, it's everywhere. There's a couple of smaller examples in this cemetery, and then there's 1 or 2 over in Tuscumbia. But this is the biggest one and maybe the best example we have. So, any questions? And Ann Craig's father. Many of you, Ann Craig Construction. Also, he was superintendent of education at one time. And of course, the high school, Bradshaw, was named for him. And it's interesting to note, I think there's a window at First Presbyterian Church. Now, are you at First Pres? Do you ever heard this story that he died in church on Christmas Day?
I've never heard that.
Yeah, that was told to me.
Of mine, and Ann was too.
Yeah, he supposedly died in church on Christmas Day. If that's true, it doesn't get any better than that.
Well, I'll find out for sure.
How about this name?
Yep, lots of Dabney.
Anybody got a name for that one? Bob Dabney. You remember Bob Dabney?
Yep.
For those folks who are not from here, Bob Dabney was one of our local characters. What do you know about him?
Oh, Lordy mercy. He'd get all the free garage sales stuff.
He drove a Cadillac. And I'll never forget one day, I was at Hardee's in North Florence, and he was in line buying $21 hamburgers.
Oh, Lord.
And he told me it's a great bargain. You just put them in the refrigerator and eat them all week.
He was tight.
Tight, but extremely generous to things like the Empty Stocking Fund, Toys for Tots, etc. One of the great philanthropists in our community. But if you saw him, you would swear this man does not have a dime to his name. He dressed just like a pauper, drove a really nice car, but the car was just full of junk. You know, interesting character. And I'll remember always when we had historical society meetings, he always came, never listened to the program. He was back in the back eating the food. Quite a character. 1811, departed this life, Florence, Alabama, 1841. She's only about 30 years old. And also with her buried are infant children, Jackson and Alexander. She died in childbirth with twins.
Oh.
Now, if you remember, she was the free woman, a free black lady who was married to the slave John Rapier.
And had a lot of money.
And John Rapier was eventually freed by his owner, Richard Rapier. But in Alabama, the law says that the children of slaves inherited their status through the mother, not the father. So her being free, all of her children were free. There were no schools for black children in Alabama in the pre-war. So all of the children were eventually sent to Nashville to live with their grandmother because they had a free black school there. So all of them received basic rudimental education of reading and writing. And two of them went on to become quite famous. James, I mentioned, became a member of the House of Representatives during Reconstruction from Alabama. And then there was another one, and for some reason I thought his name was John after the father, but he became a what we would call the equivalent of an RN, and then went on to the University of Michigan later and received further medical training, and he was a medic during the Civil War, and then worked in hospitals in the North after that. But notice, please, she's buried at a different angle than most of these graves. Bill McDonald said that was to make sure you knew she's different.
Oh.
This is an all-white section.
Yeah.
She's the only black person buried here.
I thought maybe you
That's a
had
footstone up there.
Oh.
So this is her headstone, and that's the footstone.
Oh.
And her husband later took a slave woman himself, where he went on and had children through another woman, a common law marriage. But because she was a slave woman, he owned his own children. He eventually freed them before his death. But we don't know exactly where he's buried. John, the father, her first husband.
Wonder why he didn't want to be buried here. I guess he
Well, I don't know. And that's again, I don't know where he's actually buried. I do know that he gave the land where a black congregation built a church called Pisgah on Cloverdale Road. And so I talked to the pastor of that church, who's a friend of mine, and I said, have you ever run across this name in your cemetery? He checked their records and he checked their cemetery and said, no, the name doesn't exist here. But then he said, wait a minute, the first church was up further up the road where Pisgah Methodist Church is, and he said, I bet he's buried there. So I've got to check that graveyard. I'm not positive. He may be in that graveyard. We're not sure. So, any question about her real quick? We talked about her the other night, right? Rudimental basics of a cemetery. You have a headstone, and some of them, this is a headstone, and then you have a footstone down here. And some of them have a tomb. You'll notice this modern take on tombs. Now, if you were in New Orleans, they'd be above ground. Here, it's just a fad. They're buried normally, but this was kind of a fad during the period. This person has not only got headstone, but tomb and footstone. And a lot of my favorite grave rubbings were done over relief like items like this. There's the crown and the cross. When you see this, on the headstone is the necessary information. Who it is, usually it's birth and death. And then sometimes there will appear an epitaph, like gone but not forgotten, rest in peace, etc., etc. And some of them, because we are in the Celtic South and in the Bible Belt, say, most of our symbolism is religious in nature. So here you have the scroll that symbolizes your life. It's laid out. And then on it, you know, the necessary information. Here also is a partially open flower or a fully open flower to denote that this person had a full life. If you see the flower still in bud, they died young. There's some graves over here, children like that. So you've got the ivy on the top, purely for decoration, but majority of this is religious in nature. Also, please note that there are these modern footstones. This is Henry Lee, a Confederate soldier, and that Maltese cross is also the Confederate cross. And you'll see it in other places, we'll show you. Now, for a long, long time, Confederate soldiers were considered traitors, and they were not recognized for their military service. Only in the last 25 or 30 years has that changed. Now, you can get a headstone or a footstone for your Confederate veteran ancestor if you connect with the Veterans Bureau, War Department, or Defense Department, or the Bureau of Veterans Affairs, and then you have to prove who they were and their rank and their service. So it has to be documented, and you can receive that free of charge. So you'll see this a lot in the cemetery. We have a lot of Confederate veterans buried here. Makes sense. I think I told you in class, as far as we know, we have only 7 Revolutionary soldiers buried in this county. And the reason for that is, when you go look at their graves, they came late in life. Many of them died here, within 10 years of coming here. What we have here are lots of War of 1812 soldiers, because they could claim bounty land for their time and their service. So you could receive land as in part of your pay according to your length of service and your rank. The higher the rank, the longer the service, the more land. So a lot of these veterans, early veterans, are War of 1812 men. Then of course the Civil War. Now here also we have these monuments like this behind you. And you can tell real quickly by scanning the cemetery who had the money. Because the money implied bigger headstones, bigger monuments. And in the early days, these monuments were all imported. They originally came from Italy, and then there began to be stone cutters in the United States that could mimic these things. So we'll talk a little more about that.
Well, it was more stuff that you could see in there.
There were children's toys in there.
Yes, there was stuff in there all the time.
I told people this, and they say, I don't remember that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought, have I lost my mind?
It was trashed. And they had these were open too later on, and everything was out.
I think maybe somebody got it, all right, let's just talk about who it is. For years, it lay unknown until a student that was in this class took it upon himself to find out. And because it was never put on there originally, you could not go back and do it, but you could put a brass plaque. This is the Garibaldi family, Greeks who came to this area. He owned a delicatessen, and he was a cobbler. What used to be Halter's shoe shop was his. And they lived on Pine Street, right where Bank Independent is. Yeah. All right? So they had an infant child, a daughter, and this is a mausoleum to her when she died. And I remember little girls' toys being in there, like a little dining room suit, and a doll set up at a table. Now, the reason I remember that is I was a drug kid. I was a drug to church, drug to school, and drug to the cemetery on Decoration Day. So when I came out here on Decoration Day, the last thing I wanted to do was stand around and talk about so-and-so. I was down here running and looking. I remember crawling through the brambles down in the Confederate Graveyard just to see the headstones. But this always fascinated me because we don't have another one like it in the cemetery. But she's buried here, as are her parents.
Wasn't there something up there in the crest?
Yes, but I don't remember what it was.
Yeah,
it might have been a Masonic symbol. But I think he was a Mason. But this was you can see there's an iron grate in there that divides it into 2 parts.
Yeah.
So, but it's quite interesting who's here. Now, real quick, from here, you see the flag down there? That is a Confederate burial ground. The controversy today over the Confederate monument on the courthouse square, this is where some people want it brought to, is down there. Okay, in Huntsville, they've already moved theirs to the Confederate Graveyard in Huntsville. And they did it in violation of state law. Okay, now I think over time the law will be changed to allow that, but right now it's in violation of the law. Another thing I want to point out to you is you'll see the graves down here inside of an iron fence. The city of Florence keeps up the cemetery, and the sexton tells me that they start cutting grass on Monday morning, they finish on Friday afternoon, and they start all over again on Monday morning. It takes all week and sometimes longer, depending on the weather, just to cut the grass. So they have to weed eat and mow. And you'll notice that these things are barriers to weed eaters and mowers. Mm-hmm. So when something falls over or crumbles, they do not replace it. So what you see down here is a family plot the way they used to be. Over here you see one with pipe up. You see it? Just pipes. All right? Denoting family plots. Here it's just a concrete barrier, right? But in the original old days, look up there, there's a fence around that up there. Lots of them had these fences because we had open range laws. The cattle and the hogs roamed. And they would, you've ever seen cattle and hogs get up against a tree and run? Mm-hmm. Well, if they got up against Grandpa's gravestone, they push it over. So that's to keep the cattle out. But you can understand what a barrier that is to mowing and weed eating. So, as time goes by and these deteriorate, they don't replace it. Also, you'll notice in the scanning here, back here it looks like a tree trunk with an axe on top. That's Woodman of the World life insurance policy. You could buy a policy through an insurance company called the Woodman of the World, and I promise you that guy got the best policy. I mean, that is a massive stone because many of them are very short. They are no longer in the headstone business, but I think they're still in the life insurance business. But it used to be that you bought the policy and it included a headstone. The tomb, it looks like a box right there. There's one there. There's one over here. There's a couple, 2 or 3 right here. See them? Those are different styles of tombs. Notice right here we have one that looks like a table. See it? And there's another one that looks very similar to it over here. They're just
not a mausoleum. They're not inside that concrete.
No, they're just very traditionally. You'll see them we have them at the Forks, and if you go to John Coffey Cemetery there at Walmart, you'll see them there. It's just a style or a popularity thing at that time. So one other thing, at Soldiers Rest down here, I was out here on a day in February years and years ago, cold, and there were probably 100 people here because Bill McDonald identified one of the graves that had been marked unknown for years. Now, so this lady in Louisiana, her husband joined the Louisiana, they were on the border of Texas and Louisiana, so he joined in a Louisiana group, and they were involved. Her last letter from her husband was from Tuscumbe, 1864. So about a year or so later after the war, one of the men in his unit found her, saw her. She said, "Oh, I saw he got killed." But they didn't know where he was buried. So she got started out here and just went all the way up to the Battle of Franklin and the Battle of Nashville, where his unit was involved. Could not find him in any of those graves. Finally got Bill McDonald here, and they located his grave there. De la Blesse. It's almost like a Cajun name. And what they found was, when they found his grave, rather than exhume his body, they simply brought stones from her grave and put them at his grave. And there were probably 25 or 30 descendants of that man from all over the United States here that day. There were about 100 people total in that cold day to commemorate where they finally found him. So there are many unknowns all over the country. Here's a French Huguenot background. Born in Paris and educated in London, and later settled in Franklin County, which is today Colbert. And he was one of the instrumental founders of Our Lady of the Shoals, or Our Lady of the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Tuscumbia, which was the first Catholic church founded in this area. So he was there. And he also was known for his private hospital. Back in those days, there were no such thing as public hospitals. So doctors opened their own hospital, and he had one in Florence. Notice that the Jones stone here is very highly decorated. That urn goes all the way back to the Greeks, where it was thought that that would contain your soul till it passed on. And you'll notice that the urn is shrouded in mourning, and it's also garland. And the tomb is also shrouded, and it's tasseled. Each corner has a tassel. So this was a very expensive piece of artwork, hand carved. This is the Ashcraft family. They were a very wealthy family of Florence, in the business in East Florence. This is one of his ancestors, and you'll notice if you come over here that he is a veteran of the Confederate Army, and he chose a footstone, an upright footstone, for his family chose that. And notice, please, this is the Confederate Cross. A lot of times you will see, when I was a child, they had a piece of metal made like that stuck up in the ground at the foot of these guys. I was in Savannah, Georgia, in an antique shop, and the lady had a box of those. And I said, ma'am, these are stolen. Oh, no. I said, ma'am, these are, each family is presented to this for their ancestry. Unless you bought them from the families, these are stolen. Because what they found out is they could easily steal it and sell it. And I'll tell you more about that kind of thing in a minute. So this is the Ashcrafts. Then over here are more of the Ashcrafts. Dr. Lee Duckett, MD here. The Ducketts were involved at Bailey Springs. After the Baileys owned it, they were involved there. So if you want, John Simpson was a business partner of James Jackson and Richard Rapier. We talked about it. He got his wife, Margaret, from Belfast. He was born in Belfast. They're born in Belfast. These are Scotch-Irish, if you will, who migrate to America. Now, I've heard from other historians, not just me or Bill McDonald, but when you go into Southern graveyards like this and there's a gathering of stones like this, they're called the Southern Mafia.
Now I've got two in my family.
Right. Now, it's not because they were criminals, but it's because they dominated wherever they settled. They dominated politically, they dominated economically, and socially. So these are that early group of people who settled here. It's like the Donaldsons who settled around Nashville were dominant people. The Robertsons, the Jacksons there. Whereas here, it's some of the Simpsons and others, Jackson and Coffee, etc., etc. So that idea of being in control, the dominant political economic factor, okay? You'll notice that there's a really interesting grave here, and I used to have my students come, and there's one there. You see the angelic figure carrying her away? Yeah, that's a very unusual one. A lot of my students wanted to do that for a grave rubbing. And if you will read on down, well, that one says wife of. There's another one in here, or was in here, maybe some of them, it said consort of. And my students said, I'll do exactly what you did. They go, ooh. It just simply is an old English word for wife. Okay? Relict is an old English word. It sounds old, relict is an old English word for widow. Some people say, well, I'm glad we got rid of a lot of old English words. Consort of, relic of, yes. No, and that's it. John Simpson back there built the house we call Colby Hall on UNA campus. It's actually the Simpson house. And then you remember the Kings owned it for a while, but it's called, a man from California married a local girl named Colby and bought it in her honor when she died. But that was actually the John Simpson home. There on, you know, it faces Pine and faces Court. Oh, and I forgot to point out, right here in line with me, there is a monument down there off the hill, barely off the hill. See it? The tall one? That's James Martin. He was in business in a local textile mill called Martin Bounds. And if you go out Cypress Mill Road in Florence, the reason it's called Cypress Mill Road is because it took you down to his mill. There were 3 cotton mills down there. They were all burned in the Civil War. And the history book says he had the largest textile mills in the entire South until the Union Army burned them. So that is why they were targeted, because they produced so much cloth for the Confederate Army, for uniforms. Now, these 2 sections, this one here and the one below, are for the Wood family. If you look at the map, and you have an old map in your, one of those old maps in your booklet that we gave you, it was originally called Market Street, and now it's Wood Avenue. Well, it's Wood Avenue because of Alexander H. Wood, and you'll notice this is a War of 1812 headstone. He served under Jackson and Coffee, and after the war, he was encouraged to come here by them and set up business. His house still stands on Wood Avenue. It's a cottage there, a small cottage. The Carson family lives in that house today. Yeah, it's one of the oldest houses on Wood Avenue, we think. And so he is here, and then his son, William Basil Wood, in the second plot, was the pastor of First Methodist Church and a colonel in the Confederate Army. So that plot down there is just for his direct descendants. Now, in this plot somewhere, and I haven't been able to locate her exactly, was Mr. Wood's mother-in-law. And she was born in England and baptized by John Wesley. So that's the connection here, the Wood family. Now, what I was going to tell you is, not long ago, some of that wrought iron turned up at the scrap metal place down in the river bottom. And someone down there had enough common sense to call the police. And what they found out is this man and woman had come up here and broken it off. There's a whole section missing there and a whole section missing on the end. And they had just kicked it, broke it off, and carried it down there to sell it for scrap metal. Now, you'll notice it's not been replaced, and it will not be replaced. The city has a policy that they're just not going to replace these barriers. Notice the one behind Daughtry is grown into the tree. Or the tree is grown into it. So that's just part of, that'll stay there until the tree comes down. Quick story about the wood. William Basil Wood had a brother named Alexander Sterling Martin Wood. Alexander Sterling Martin Wood. Sam for short, they just called him Sam. He rose to the rank of Brigadier General in the Confederate Army. And prior to the Battle of Atlanta, he had a falling out with a new commander named Hood, General Hood, and resigned his commission and went back to the University of Alabama, where he taught law. Now, any University of Alabama grads? I'm the only one. Daughtry's pointing at me. Wood Hall. Yeah. Still have classes in Wood Hall. Named for him. He's buried in the faculty cemetery there at Tuscaloosa. And if you study the Civil War, when the fighting occurred in Florence, he just happened to be home on furlough when the Union Army came to burn those mills, and he organized the local militia to try to fight them off. But it just simply, there's too many people too quick. So here we stand in front of another family named Wood. These are the planters of one of the one of the plantations we will see in 2 weeks. We'll go to their home called Woodlawn. Originally called Woodland, but now it's Woodlawn. And he is born in County Down of Ireland and became a naturalized citizen. His wife was born in Scotland. It's interesting to note they first settled in Louisiana, and they were good friends of James Jackson of the Forks of Cyprus. And he wrote James Jackson that it was hotter than Hades in South Louisiana. Now, if you've ever been down there in the summer, you know what he's talking about. I've been in the fields of cotton here in Florence, Lauderdale County, and I promise you, Louisiana's hotter. It's amazing how hot. So they said, why don't you move back up here? So he moved back up here and bought that land and built that plantation. Now, he died before the war, and she took her 2 grandsons back to Scotland to be educated so they would not be drafted into the Confederate Army. And then when she returned, she left a black overseer, one of the slaves, in charge, and everything was in place when she got back. She didn't know what she was going to come back to. She didn't know if it'd be burned, looted out. We didn't know. She didn't know, but she came back. Eventually, John Coffey's son, Alexander Donaldson Coffey, he bought the house, bought the property for a while, and kept it for a good period of time. Then he sold it back to the descendants. Now, Rear Admiral John Hood, United States Navy, was the last of the Hoods to live there. And he was a survivor of the USS Maine that blew up in Havana Harbor. If you remember your American history, that's the cause of the Spanish-American War. So he was an admiral in the Spanish-American War, and then an admiral in World War I. And the World War II destroyer Hood is named for in honor of him. And he is buried at Annapolis. So the last of the Hoods lived there until about 1920, 1920. And then sold out of the family. Today owned by David and Faye Abramson. Bessie Rapier Foster died in 1963 and was the first black person on the Florence Chamber of Commerce. She had her own string of beauty shops and beauty what do you call it? Supplies for black beauty shops. He was married to this woman, Sarah Andrews, and when she died, he married Mary Coffey O'Neill, the widow of General O'Neill. This was her last husband, but she's not buried here. She's buried up by the general. Kind of strange. Family members say that she was also called among the family Whispering Mary. She was so polite and so reserved that they said you almost had to get up in her face to understand what she said. To get that shrinking, huh? Can you read this? Yeah. What is it? It's Hebrew. It's Hebrew. As far as we know, this is the only Jewish burials in this cemetery. Okay? He was a businessman in Florence, and he owned, back then they called them dry goods. They were like mercantile business. And if you read about Tom Clark, the infamous outlaw, this is one of the people he and his friends preyed upon. Knowing he had money, they tortured him for money. Now, Bill McDonald called me one day and he said, by the way, he's born in Prussia. And he called me, he said, there's a guy, he said, you know where this grave is? I said, yeah. He said, there's a guy coming from Columbia University in New York. He's doing his doctoral dissertation on early Jewish businessmen of the Old South. And he's coming to look at this Falk grave, Alexander Falk. And he said, I gotta be somewhere, can you meet him? I said, sure. So he lands in Huntsville, goes to the Huntsville graveyards, comes here, eventually goes to Sheffield to those graveyards. The Sheffield Graveyard is consecrated ground. That's where you find almost all the Jewish burials. And so, because the 2 founders of Sheffield were Jewish. So I meet him, we talk a few minutes. I'm going to send you a copy of my book. Haven't heard a word. And as far as I know, the book's not been published. So I don't know if he didn't get his degree. I don't know. But I haven't heard a word. But anyway, notice the name. He had a nephew that founded a town near here called Falkville. Yeah. Isn't that over in near Decatur, outside of Decatur?
Yeah, between Hartselle and Coleman.
Hartselle and Coleman area, right, Falkville. So, another one of those graves with the, notice this particular ironwork is on a railroad iron. See it? Do you all remember the first time you went in there?
About? No. About.
Do you know at one time it was the largest continuous family-owned department store in Alabama before they closed it? And many of us have, you know, it was a big deal to go to Rogers. But do you ever remember, or did your dad or anybody tell you what it was once named?
Surprise
It was once named
Surprise
the
store.
Surprise Store, because they had sacks you could buy for X amount of money, and you could get surprises. Just surprise what you pick up, you know. That's what I was told. James Jackson III, who was a descendant of James Jackson of the Forks, lived in Tuscumbia. And he said when he was a little boy, he convinced his mother to bring him to the Surprise Store. And they were going to get to ride the trolley over the railroad bridge. Now, folks, the trolley went on top. Cars went underneath. There are no handrails or guardrails on top. He said when they got out in the middle of the river, the electricity went off. And a thunderstorm came up the river so bad, he said, that it vibrated the bridge. Now there they are in an open trolley car being pelted by the, and he said felt like hail. He said it was so bad I crawled under my mother's skirt. And when the electricity came on, I begged to go home. So they got, the trolley continued to East Florence, where they waited on another car and went back to Tuscumbia. He said, forget it, I wasn't going back. So he said, I didn't go back to Florence until I was almost a teenager. So I had that bad memory, so I always thought about that. All right. This is the family plot of James Irvin, born in Londonderry, Ireland. And he was married to Emily Boggs of Pennsylvania. She was the first cousin to Julia Dent, who was USS Grant's wife. So the Civil War had a lot of connections. You never heard of brother versus brother and cousin versus cousin connections. We know that he also was a member, I think, of First Presbyterian Church, leading attorney in town. And we'll talk more about him this upcoming Thursday night. But it says that when he died, every store in town closed in honor of the family and all the bells tolled. Now, Sue King Huffstedler, direct descendant, and she's buried in that section back there. That's one of her. Alice Walker, Janet Walker. And notice, Janet Walker says relict of, she's widowed. He died first, look what she got for him. My wife said typical. That's the way you see it a lot. At the Forks Cemetery, James Jackson, Sally Jackson. Very small. Niall Elting was from New York, First National Bank. They had no children, but this is a monument to them. Great view. Now, I'm told that First Presbyterian has a trust fund set up for them, that there are flowers on this grave every holiday.
I don't know about the flowers for the grave, but we have a trust fund.
There's a trust fund. I've been told that. You'll come out here like at Christmas, you'll see flowers. All right, medical doctor in Florence, early doctor, lived at a home on Pine Street called Mapleton. Used to be behind what used to be the old Coca-Cola building. I was laughing about that. Comcast today, and it faces the river bottom. And it was later the home of McFarland, General McFarland. So, and by the way, the Todds are from Kentucky. He had two sisters that never married. One's buried here, the other one's buried back in Kentucky. They are cousins, first cousins or second cousins, who married Todd Lincoln. She's Kentucky. But interesting fact, her family had slaves. And her in-laws, cousins, and even a brother fought in the Confederate Army against the brother-in-law, President Lincoln. Now, standing here, look to the tall pine tree beyond the hill beyond. And to the left of the tall pine tree, we see three graves that look relatively new. See them? Those are three black Confederate soldiers. Many black men were taken into the army as body servants of their owners. One of which was the son of Patton, future Governor Patton of Sweetwater. His son Billy was killed at the Battle of Shiloh, and the governor, future governor, told the body servant, no matter what happens, you get his body home. Sam was his name. We don't know how Sam did it, but 2 days after Battle of Shiloh, they brought his body back to Sweetwater. He's buried there. And Sam was given his freedom and land. Now, these men were all slaves, but all of them were also gun toters. And I think some of you, and I'll tell you this. I had a professor at Alabama that said that a black Confederate soldier was as rare as hair on a frog. And I said, wait a minute. I know where there's three buried. Impossible, he said. So when I came home, I got all this information, took it back, and he said that was nothing more than Confederate propaganda. But, here we go. At the end of the Civil War, Union soldiers got paid a pension by the United States Congress. Confederate soldiers got nothing, unless your state paid something. Now, knowing Alabama, the way Alabama was and is, do you think they would give a black man a pension if he had not been a soldier? Those three men got pensions. We know of 7 buried in the county that got legitimate soldier pensions from the state of Alabama. But they were all enslaved men. And there are 3 of them. If you go to Pope's Tavern, there are pictures of reunions, the old veteran reunions. 3 of those black men are in those pictures. And, you know, it's rarer in the Southern Army than in the Northern Army, but it did exist. Okay. We have only a few angelic cards, figures here in the cemetery, but if you want to see a really good one, go to the old Tuscumbia Cemetery. There is a gorgeous angel card there. Historic marker that talks about him being the meanest man from Lauderdale County, who bragged at his trial that he killed 20 plus. And the only one he was ever resentful for or regretted was he killed an infant because she had a necklace with a dime on it. And he said, I felt bad, but I'd already killed her mom and daddy. So I killed her. And basically he makes a brag that nobody ever ran over Tom Clark. So after about 2 days of trial, the good people of Florence had enough, and they broke into jail where him and 2 men with him were taken out on Tom Bigby Street and lynched. And the story goes they were going to bury him in the cemetery, but family members said that we don't want those outlaws buried here with our families. So one story says they were buried across the street in a vacant lot. But we're not sure where that would have been. But another story says, no, Tom Clark was buried under the street so everybody could run over him. Well, it makes a great story, but it's not factual. And this is the reason I'm telling you. Bill McDonald said one day he was out here in the cemetery, and he was walking around talking to different people, and a man walked up to him, a man and woman, and asked him if he was Bill McDonald, and so forth. And they said, well, how would you like to come to a family reunion and talk? And he said, well, I've done that before. No problem. Where's it going to be? They said, well, before we tell you, let me tell you this. It's the descendants of Tom Clark. And he said, what? He said, yes, all of us are descendants of the outlaw Tom Clark. And we want you to come and tell us all you know about him, and then we're going to tell you all we know about him. So he said he went. I said, well, where was this thing done? He said it was done in Tuscumbia, and they carried me and showed me his grave. He said during the night, after he had been executed, some family members came and dug him up and carried him to Tuscumbia and buried him. So, that's all I know. Okay? Now, the marshal who arrested him, Marshal Blair, is buried right up there. At this point, I talk a lot about epitaphs. This is a great epitaph. You'll notice that there's an anchor here, and if you get up close, you can read, it says, through the sycamore, the candlelights are gleaming along the banks of the river Tennessee. Well, I used to ask my students, sometimes the epitaph reveals the occupation of the person. He's a riverboat captain. Okay? Lauderdale County had 3 distinct communities of foreign people. There is St. Florian, not Florine. It's not I-N-E, it's I-A-N. Only our southern vernacular, we pronounce everything wrong. St. Florine. By this name, it's named for a man named Florian Rash. I think he'd be offended by being known as Florine. But it's a German Catholic community, right? It's still a great community. Cloverdale was once known as what?
Rawhide.
Rawhide, because of the trade business of furs. It was a community for the Finns. 20-something Finnish families settled there, and it had the name at one time of Little Finland. Zen, Sweden. A group of Swedes were brought here to work on the Louisville to Nashville Railroad, running directly north-south, and they settled in Jacksonburg. There's a graveyard up there in Jacksonburg where a lot of them are. So about 10 families were brought here as railroad families, and that was their little community, Jacksonburg. So I taught some Zens when I taught at Wilson one year, and in the last class I had out here, the last time I was out here with the Florence Tourism, there was a lady in the group whose maiden name was Zen. There's not many of them left. You don't have to know who it was, but by what you see, you ought to know what he was. Here, what do you see? I see a hammer, a wrench, and a wheel. He's a mechanic. And he died on the second Muscle Shoals Canal. And they brought him and buried him here. Not from here, but notice you don't always have to have it in words. I don't have my keys with me. This is R.O. Pickett, Confederate veteran, later on the Florence City Council. The Pickett place is right across from Pope's Tavern. We're told that by him being on the Florence Council, he's the one that kept the big trees from being cut. That a lot of the big trees we still enjoy in town are because of him. What I wanted to show you is this. Metal. Not many of them. They thought it might catch on, but you don't see a lot of them. His wife, can you make this out? Lisa, can you make that out? What's there? See the narrow gate? Where it talks about narrow is the gate and narrow the way. If you shall find it in Scripture, in Matthew. You'll see that on a lot of graves in the South. The gate is barely open. All right, here are the Milners. This is Joseph Milner of Milner Drug. His brother here, Samuel Milner. They were from Leeds, England. Now the story goes, it depends on who you read and what you want to believe, but here it comes. One story says they came to Alabama, brought their mother, settled here in Florence, went to the California gold fields and made some money. Came back and invested their money, each one of them having a business. He was the pharmacist, in those days without a pharmaceutical license. And this one was the owner of the Milner woolen mills in Cowpen. And he had a company town up there. You know, your workers lived around the mill. And he had built a church for them called Milner Chapel Methodist Church. Samuel Milner. So they're brothers. The other story says no. First they went from England to California, made money, and eventually settled here. Doesn't matter. Very prominent.
Yeah.
He's one of the ones. Joseph Milner was tortured by Tom Clark and his outlaws. And it is said that he never fully recovered from it. Okay? He lived on the corner across the street from First Methodist, there where the clinic is. He lived right on the corner across from the farm. These are descendants of his, and this is Captain John, who was captured at Gettysburg and died at Fort Delaware Prison. This is a memorial because he is buried in an unmarked grave at Fort Delaware Prison. This is Pocahontas Chisholm. We have a Pocahontas Perkins at the Forks. Supposedly, they're all descendants of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. She married John Rolfe of the Jamestown colony, goes back to England, and there she died of, it says, of the fever. Probably the influenza, we don't know. But she's buried in England. They had one son. So if all these people are descendants, that comes a long way down, okay? This is Zebulon Pike Morrison, born in Lexington, Virginia. He is the mayor of Florence when Tom Clark was captured. In those days, they didn't have a mayor full-time. He was just like a Florence councilman, one of them designated as the spokesman of the mayor. And one of the things I want to point out to you is this gravestone is signed by the person who built it. His name is Eldred, E-L-D-R-E-D. Now we know that this Eldred was a Union soldier. And he came through Florence, liked it, and when he came, he also realized and saw that they did not have a stone cutter here. So after the war, he comes back and settles here. And a lot of these really, really pretty stones we're going to see are all Eldreds. You know, great artists sign their work. Zebulon Pike Morrison held a number of different hats. City council. He was also the city mortician. I think there's a funeral home.
Morrison.
Oh yeah. Also, he was a contractor. He had a contracting company that built three of the most important things we still see in Florence. Wesleyan Hall on the UNA campus. The house at the end of Court Street called Rogers Hall, he built that. And then he built where the downtown post office is. If you go in and see that mural on the wall of the girls' college that was owned by First Presbyterian Church, he built that. So he wore many, many hats. Okay? He's too young to have served in the American Revolution. He could have possibly served in the War of 1812 as a teenager. More than likely, we think he served in the Indian Wars before the Civil War, but we probably was too old for the Civil War. But he holds the rank of captain. Now we do know the Key family lived out down in the river bottom and had a plantation, and there is a place down there called Key Cave. It's part of protected site, protected wildlife refuge, part of the Wheeler Wildlife Refuge. But the interesting thing is this symbol. You get a little closer, it gets a little freakier.
It's like a pirate.
You see that cross? There's that cross.
Yeah.
The Southern Cross of Honor.
Is it a Masonic symbol?
You'll notice there's cross swords and knightshood. So this is the military side of it. You know, he was a soldier. But you'll notice there's a skull and crossbones. And in Latin, it reads, "In this sign death." I had my Latin teacher from Coffee come out here and interpret.
What does that mean, though, in this sign?
It's got to almost be a military fraternity.
Like a Masonic law.
Masonic.
It's not Masonic. One person came out here, and we had a big crowd out here. I'll never forget this. And I simply said, "Has anybody ever seen this before?" And he reluctantly said, "Yes. It's Knights Temple."
Oh.
Yeah, that's right.
Catholic.
And at Yale, there is a group called the Skull and Bones. And two of our presidents have been members, the Bushes. So
Yeah,
I don't know any more about this.
that's strange.
It's really a strange grave. Plantation called the Buck, B-U-C-K, Buck Key Plantation. Where's Buck? You ever heard of the Key Plantation? You were out in that area. Of course, that's Key Springs, Key Cave. You ever heard of this man, the Perrys? Okay. Frank Perry? I know your dad remembers Frank Perry. Did anybody ever heard a rumor about Frank Perry?
Yeah.
What?
Frank James.
They said he was Frank James. My grandfather told me that. Well, I've had some family members, they just laughed when I told them that. They said they had never heard that. Well, I don't know how that got started, but this man at one time acquired the most property in Lauderdale County. He was a massive landowner. And the Perry estate was, you could drive on it for miles and miles at one time. He had an office upstairs above Herald Printing, across from what was then called the telephone company, South Central Bell. And the story goes that a salesman came to town, and before we had the automobiles, and he rented a buggy. And he drove over to the office and told a man, "I'll pay you a dime to hold my horse." And he ran upstairs and said, "I want to see Mr. Perry." And the secretary said, "Well, he just stepped out." And she looked down there and she said, "He's holding somebody's horse." And the story goes, the man goes down and just vehemently apologizes. And he said, "That's okay, but you're not going to get your dime back." Now, whether they take out a broken link. If you get on there, you can see it's a broken link that they're removing. Symbolic of being taken. Now, I have only seen this one time. Most of the hands are going this way. But sometimes you'll see it this way only once. I've only seen it that way. I don't know what the meaning of it is, but it's kind of rare. Then I have only seen one other where there's not a link here, but the finger is pointing down. I don't know what that means either. The Rice family, the Rices were very prominent in the Oakland area. Right in that section is buried another man named Neander Rice. Neander Rice was very unique in this sense. He was a known registered Republican during the Civil War in Florence, Alabama. That's like hen's teeth. You know, how brave was he to have voted for Abraham Lincoln? And was proud of it. He served on the city council and was on the city council when Tom Clark was hanged. Oh, man. What is that? It's a shock of wheat known as a sheave. And there's a hymn,
Bringing in the sheaves.
bringing in the sheaves. One of my sisters said, "Nope, it's bringing in the sheets."
That's what I thought.
The sheaves.
Sheets.
Sheets.
Like hanging up the sheets. And down here is, I wouldn't get very close to this, but here are two important graves. These are the Sononers. We'll talk Thursday night about Ferdinand Sonona, who was an Italian surveyor who helped survey the city of Florence. He lived here for a number of years. This is his brother, John Baptiste Sonona, and it says here, died of dropsy, heart disease. And notice this, his brother Ferdinand, and it says paternal affection, placed on this tomb on his cold remains. The original stones stood up and were knocked over and broken. So they had the city of Florence, because of Ferdinand Sonona, made these. And this is Ferdinand Sonona's infant child. Now we know that he and his brother operated a delicatessen here, and when they were doing the excavation for the downtown library, they found a large catch of wine bottles in the basement of one of the houses. It turned out that Sonona owned that piece of property, and that he had wine stored in his basement for his delicatessen. So that the archaeological excavation finished that to prove that it was owned one time by Ferdinand Sonona. The family moved to Memphis, where he and his wife both died and are buried. But he has big connections. Get a little closer. What's on top? Shoes and socks. I wonder how many times my mother told me to pick up my shoes and socks. This is a little boy's grave. Right here in this corner is a very important family here from Atlanta, and built the Florence Wagon Company. And at one time it was the largest employer of people in the city. And they built the most, other than Studebaker of Indianapolis, Indiana, they built the most wagons in America, other than Studebaker.
Yes, John was a year older than me, but we were friends growing up, and I spent the night over at their house over on
Tate Springs.
Yeah, no, but this was in town when they still had the house in town.
Okay.
And Lake Tate was just he was just out, he was a character. He was out there. And of course he was a pilot, and everything. But I can remember when I spent the night over there, he got to chasing us around the house with, I believe, what was a 410 shotgun. And I asked Miss Tate when she came by, because I was behind the couch, and I said, now he is kidding. I mean, he joked, right? And she just laughed. You know how Doodle would just laugh.
His wife was named Doodle.
It was all in fun. But now, from growing up in my house,
Your perspective.
where things were pretty calm, and going over there, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. He was
Do
something.
you know who he claimed descendants through? Doublehead.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
really?
that marker out there by their land
Yeah.
got all that on
Yes.
it.
Yes. Chief Doublehead. And he was proud of it. Now his wife, what was her real name? They called her Doodle. But Martha. She rode horses up until almost the day she died. She was so that whole family were characters.
Yes.
Yeah.
They
were all characters.
That was really something.
Tate Springs, right out
Well,
there on the original Weeklies came to Alabama along with Ferdinand Sonona and John Coffey. And he was a land surveyor, the original Weekly. So when John Coffey was given the U.S. government commission to survey North Alabama, he sent out Weekly and Sonona to survey. So Weekly's descendants settled in Florence and lived on Pine Street, right close to Colby Hall. There's a parking lot, and there was an architect's office right there. Well, their house sat right there, facing Pine. Well, Miss Jim became the local Florence character. She's the lady that went down the street with an umbrella and slapped away dogs and kids, getting in her way. She's the woman that I've read about and heard about, that there was a marriage announcement at Trinity Episcopal Church where she got married, and then about 2 weeks later he left town. And she went back to Miss Jim. So I've seen the marriage announcement and everything, and they were married, but he didn't last long. And so there's a story. I had a lady out here that was connected to the story. So I used to ask, does anybody have a story? And she said, when my mother was pregnant with me, she said she ran into Miss Jim and was talking to her and said, well, when your baby due, etc., etc. So later, she's pushing the baby down the street. Miss Jim stopped her. She said she stopped her by putting her umbrella out and stopping the stroller. Said, I want to see your baby. He said, what'd you name her? And she said when she told her what she named her, Miss Jim said, ugliest name I ever heard.
Oh.
And just walked off. So she was that character that would wait to about 10 minutes before the store closes, and then she'd go in when everybody else left. She wanted to be served. She didn't want to be in there with anybody else. And do you remember Holt? Did any of you remember Holt, who was postmaster here? Supposedly he caught her stuck in the mail chute where she was trying to crawl in and see if she had any mail on Sunday. I don't know if that's true, but this woman must have been quite a character. This is Barr, B-A-R-R, who died at a young age. You can see because the rose on this side is barely open. And then you go on the other side, you'll see his pets, the dog and cat. And the Bartoon people, these are some relatives. Now, we'll tell you now, General O'Neill was a colonel in the Confederate Army at Gettysburg. And he fought under the command of Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S. And after Gettysburg, Lee trimmed his army, meaning Lee accepted full responsibility for the defeat, but Lee secretly, if you read the book Lee and His Lieutenants, Lee said, the men who are not militarily trained, I do not trust any longer. So he made sure that all of these non-West Point people are out. He had not one day of military training. Because he was a wealthy man, he raised a regiment of men. They appointed him as officer, and off to war they go. And then he rose in rank because of political appointments. He was up for command or appointment as general, and Lee refused to give it to him. So he is sent home, and the state of Alabama gave him the title. So, this is a death mask. You know, a wax mask was taken of famous people like Lincoln and Jefferson and others so that a statue could be built from it. So this is supposedly his death mask. Also, very symbolic. I'm told that if you are a military person, you would come out here and instantly recognize this is military. You see the sword? It's also shrouded. And this is part of that controversy we have going on today of what they call the lost cause. The war, Civil War is over, but Southerners believe that it was a lost cause. So it's shrouded in mourning for that. And you notice that the column itself is fluted like a plantation house column, which is symbolic of the good old days, the antebellum South. Okay? His wife is the daughter of Alexander Donaldson Coffey. She is the granddaughter of John Coffey. And Alexander Donaldson Coffey had another daughter named Eliza Coffey, which the hospital was named for. So that's where Mary Coffey is buried. Has that name. This is Judge Robert Tennant Simpson, educated at Princeton. You'll notice that Simpson family crest. This is part of that same Simpson original family. This is the best angelic figure we have in the cemetery. And it is an Eldred. It's done by the same Eldred sign down here at the bottom, you see. And then that is his wife's grave. And what is very unusual about that is that the bottom, the very bottom is limestone, then the middle is granite, and the top is marble. It's almost like they found different pieces and it's put them together. Whereas she has got an anchor, if you look at that, she's got a ship's anchor. And she's looking out to sea. Doesn't fit here, but that's his wife. He's buried at the Chattanooga Civil War Cemetery for Union veterans. Okay? And she's buried here. go back out. The family story says that when the Union Army stayed on their place, that Mrs. Cunningham served them supper, and the officers of the Union soldiers wanted her to play the piano for them. And supposedly she got up and dismissed herself and basically said, "You can stay in my house and you can eat my food, but never will you make me play the piano for you." And went to bed.
Good for her.
Now, one last thing. Here is that same cross. And this is another plantation family, Thompsons. Their plantation was at Pride in Colbert County, and they're buried here. But that is the best replica we have of the Southern Cross of Honor. All right, anyone have a question? Because it's pretty much, this is the last of it. We're now right back out at the Celtic Cross.
Look at this one. This one, that's pretty with the wreath.